Texas early voting runs from October 23rd to November 3rd. If you're registered to vote in Travis County, you can early vote on campus at the FAC. VoteTravis.com has a full list of Austin area early voting locations. You can search all Texas early voting locations at votetexas.gov. In Texas, you must show a government-issued photo ID like a Texas driver's license or U.S. passport to vote. You can early vote Monday through Saturday between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. or on Sunday from noon to 6 p.m. Time to early vote, Longhorns.
Live from the University of Texas at Austin, the Liberal Arts Development Studios present Essentials of AI for Life and Society. And now, here are your professors, Joydeep Biswas, Don Fissell, and Peter Stone.
Hi, I'm Joydeep Biswas, and let's see where we stand. So, in the past few weeks, we've covered many of the pieces of AI technologies and algorithms. We looked at the philosophical foundations for AI, and we're actually going to start now looking into issues at the intersection of AI and humans and society. So to kick this off, actually, the topic for today is AI and mis/disinformation. And to present this topic is Professor Matt Lease. So Matt is professor in the School of Information at the University of Texas at Austin. His research is at the intersection of AI and HCI, and he's done a lot of cool work on things like content moderation and how you need to do this in the human-in-the-loop manner, and actually look at practices for curbing disinformation, hate speech, and polarization online. A lot of this work is in support of UT Austin's Good Systems Grant Challenge to develop responsible AI technologies. And for much of this work, Matt has been recognized with many Best Paper Awards, and including early career awards from DARPA, from NSF, and IMLS. So with that, I hand it over to Matt to introduce this fascinating topic.
Hello, everyone. Very nice to be here today. As I was introduced, my name is Matt Lease. I'm a professor in the School of Information, and I'm excited to talk to you today about misinformation and disinformation and the intersection with artificial intelligence. So I think there's a lot of excitement today about things like generative AI technologies, large language models. So for instance, here's sort of a fun example from the Bipartisan Policy Center, where they asked GPT to write a sonnet about bipartisanship. Or we've seen other examples with, say, generative AI around imagery. So asking, for instance, to generate an image about the Cowboys, winning a Super Bowl, what that would look like for the victory parade. But we've also seen that, like other AI technologies, when there's opportunities for benefits, there's also risks or new chances for harms. So if you see sort of an example like this, where we take pictures of celebrities and change something about them, maybe this is all fun and interesting and just playing with, but it starts to raise some of these questions more about what's real and what's not. And as we start to look at more applications, like when people have fake images of explosions that affect financial markets, or spreading information in crisis situations like when we have a hurricane, then it becomes much more problematic. And so broadly, in AI, like so many other technologies, we see a lot of great new opportunities and a lot of potential for benefit. But there's always this risks of harm or chances of misuse. So we're always trying to think about how is it that we can get the best of the benefits and mitigating the risks or the degree of harm that could happen with this. And this is something we're thinking at both a technological level, at a societal level, and at a policy level. So here at Good Systems, I imagine many of you have already heard a good bit about it, but this is a university-wide endeavor where we're trying to think about how we can develop AI technologies to maximize societal benefits while minimizing the risks of harm. And in terms of artificial intelligence, I think you guys have heard a lot this semester. It's more than just this generative AI you hear so much about it and deep learning. It's this broad set of technologies with a lot of diverse set of applications. So today I'll be talking about generally information access and sharing. And so we're thinking about how AI technologies might influence things like how we share, produce, access information online, how, for instance, something like fake news might be spread, other kinds of harmful content. And how is it that we can prevent or mitigate the spread of this kind of harmful content with or without AI technologies? So I'm involved in one of these Good Systems projects we have at the university called Designing Responsible AI Technologies to Curb Disinformation. So this mouthful in that title And we've already just sort of unpacked a little bit about what we were saying when we talk about AI. I want to unpack next what we say when we're talking about disinformation. So this is sort of a very familiar graphic or breakdown. You can see a lot of different places. When people talk about the spread between whether information is true or not, its falseness, and whether the information has intent to harm or not. This is a Venn diagram. At the intersection of these two things, we see disinformation. So disinformation is intentional, inaccurate information with an intent to harm. On the other hand, misinformation is maybe inadvertent, accidental misinformation. So this could be, for instance, that somebody doesn't know something is true, is incorrect, that they're spreading. That could be just benignly brought about, or it could be that they're forwarding something that was a disinformation campaign that started somewhere else, or just something they have a common misunderstanding about. On the other hand, we have malinformation. So this is information which, regardless of whether or not it's true, is being created with an intent to harm. So for instance, in some recent cases where we've had foreign interference with US politics, we've seen cases where the information shared wasn't necessarily incorrect, but it was spread in a way to be divisive and to sort of sow a lot of emotional discontent. So this notion of disinformation or fake news, as we talk about so much these days, it's come up a lot in the past 5, 10 years or so, but it has a much longer history. I always like to remember back to the 19th century when the famous publisher Hearst said, "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." This sort of yellow journalism has history way farther back than the 19th century. So what's really new and different is the way that when technology accelerates the way at which individuals or groups can spread or create this kind of information. So the scale and speed at which it's being spread and what we can do about it. I think it's also important to remember that when we talk about this sort of information that may or may not be correct, it's not simply binary, true or false. Often there's a spectrum of what we call veracity, how true the information is, but also irrespective of veracity, there's this notion of persuasive technologies or persuasive communications. And it might be anything from say, a benign sort of the spectrum here on the left when you're trying to inform people, all the way to extreme on the right when we're trying to coerce people. So we can think about this kinds of information in terms of the communication intent behind it as well when we think about the effects it will have and the intents behind it. So we're talking a lot in our project about fact-checking. So fact-checking starts with a claim. A claim is something like this that you might see on social media. For in this case, it's Bill Gates' mRNA vaccine is approved for use against non-consenting humans. So some fearful thing that this thing is being used against people without their consent. So what will happen is a fact-checking organization like PolitiFact, whose editor-in-chief is actually a UT alumnus, will go and do due diligence, investigate this particular claim, and provide information about whether it's true or not. So that kind of human fact-checking is sort of the gold standard, and that's been so helpful today as we've had spread of this inaccurate information online for providing us reliable journalistic sources that we can really trust to get past some of the hype and really find where we think the ground truth is. Now, the challenges we see here in this plot is with the human fact-checking on the bottom, we see the spread going up much steeper of the sort of spread of misinformation or disinformation online. And that gap is only widening. So we have a real challenge of scale in terms of meeting the need. In some sense, there's no way right now that the human professional fact-checking processes will be able to scale to ever get all this information that's being spread. And the question is, what do we try to do about that? So I want to say a little bit about what fact-checking involves, because this gives us a sense, first of all, about what people are doing and why it takes so long, and then thinking about what it would mean if we wanted to try to automate some or all of these processes. So we'll start in this case with a claim we want to check. We want to go find relevant evidence, so something that's relevant about it. We might do a search. And then for each piece of evidence we find, we want to first assess its stance. Does it support or refute the claim? How strongly? And we want to assess the credibility of that information. You know, how much should we trust where it's coming from? Maybe something that comes from a reliable news outlet is something you want to trust more than something you see on Twitter/X. So once we've gathered all this evidence, we've assessed its stance, we've assessed credibility, then we want to aggregate it to reach an overall conclusion about what we think is the veracity of this claim. Is it true or false, or to what degree? And I want to show the same thing again from a process as if we have maybe an AI or some kind of automation we're going to do to try to do this. So again, here's some other claim. Immigrants are a drain on the economy. You might start with a claim like this, and you try to first go get relevant information retrieval, find relevant documents about this. Then once I've retrieved them, do this kind of stance detection or something called textual entailment. Again, we were trying to figure out, does information in the evidence support the claim being raised? And so for instance, again, that stance might be positive, neutral, negative. And then this veracity stage where we're trying to see something about, do we think the overall claim is true or not, and how true is it? So AI is certainly much more scalable, or I should say automation more generally is much more scalable, but it's far from perfect. And this is something which I think we always need to remember about AI technologies. They'll never be perfect. They'll always make mistakes, just like people. And so the question is, what do we want to do about the fact that we have fallible AI technology? In particular, right now, we see there's always a frontier where AI is getting better and better, but for instance, that frontier today, at least, is inferior to what human fact checkers can do when they carry out these processes. So how can people effectively use AI systems in this kind of context when they do make mistakes? And then AI systems typically, traditionally, do not explain their outputs or predictions. So why should you trust an opaque AI model that just tells you whether something is true or false when you don't trust a fact checker or you don't trust a journalistic source? And this is especially true, say, in a high-stakes setting or in any kind of setting where you have really issues of trust, as I was saying today. And so just to step back for a second, what we're doing here in this project around disinformation is we are trying to really look at the societal problem around disinformation and misinformation and figure out what we can do to help curb its spread. But we also want to learn general lessons about how we can improve this sort of responsible AI technology. And these are just some of the big questions we have in general, as well as outside this particular project, which helps to ground our research about artificial intelligence. So can we get the best of both the scalability of AI and the sort of human accuracy? So some of the things that we often talk about in this space are called human-AI teaming or human in the loop. Sometimes people actually refer to it instead as algorithm in the loop when I have a human decision maker and I'm using a decision support technology to help that human decision maker do their job better. But when we think about what AI can do and what people can do, they each have their strengths. They're complementary. And ideally, we should be able to design, to construct some kind of whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. So how can we build an effective human and AI team in this space around curbing disinformation? So we've been, in our project, specifically trying to support international fact checkers. For instance, I've done some research with my students where we've interviewed over 25 professional fact checkers from around the world to really understand what they want AI technology to do to help them do their work more effectively. So in our project, when we're thinking about responsible artificial intelligence, we're particularly focusing on fairness and explainability. So how can we design AI technologies that are fair and explainable to support human fact checkers? So I want to unpack this a little bit further. So when we talk about responsible AI or AI governance, there's often a set of different principles that people are talking about trying to address. And so the first thing I want to talk a little bit about is this notion of what's listed here as transparency. So transparency goes under other terms related like explainable or interpretable AI technology. And then we're always concerned about the reliability of artificial intelligence. And often we think about using humans as a backstop, or if we have a human in the loop, if we have a human AI team, they'll be able to ensure that we get up to that desired level of accuracy that maybe the AI can't get to on its own. Okay, so again, these are the things we're trying to address. For instance, this AI making mistakes and this business about explainability. So I wanted to show a demo for a minute. This is work with collaborators and actually a myriad of students, including a couple of local high school students. And so we have an online demo I'd like to switch to now to show you. And I'll show you an example of what we can do here. So this is a demo that looks kind of like Google, but we say we want to check a claim rather than just look something up. So if I go to check this particular claim, for instance, about a 5-year-old boy was invoiced for missing a birthday party. Okay, I'm going to see here a variety of things. First, at the top, I have some notion of the system predicting whether or not this claim is true or not. Down below it, you can see, kind of like a Google search results, your relevant articles that were retrieved. For each article, we see the headline, and we can actually click on either of these if we want to just look at the search result, just like we would with a normal search browser. But we see a couple of other things. We see where that article came from. So for instance, this one came from the BBC. And we see what the reputation of the BBC is predicted to be. So, should I trust information that comes from this source? Okay, well, one question you might ask is, well, why should I trust the system telling me what the reputation is? Where did this predicted reputation come from? So we provide a transparency here where you can actually go and inspect the training data that the model was trained on, and you can literally see for all the past stories in the data set where the BBC provided some information, how often was it correct or not. So very intuitive, just looking how often has this source been correct in the past, and based on that, we're going to decide how reliable we think it is today. Similarly, for each one of these articles, we're going to predict whether or not it supports the claim, refutes the claim, or doesn't tell us anything. Now, how do we do this kind of information aggregation in general if we were doing this on our own? Okay, so you find the relevant sources. Again, for each source, we see how much should we trust it. For each source, how much does it support or refute the claim of interest? And then we sum it all up. We aggregate all this information. So that's what this system is doing. But what's cool is you can start to interact with it. So for instance, let's say that you know the BBC is more reliable than this. You can actually grab this reputation and increase it or decrease it. And you can see that that's in real time going to change how the model makes predictions. So one thing you can see already from that is that, for instance, if you and somebody else have different beliefs, it may be because you're ascribing different reputations to the same source when you even look at the same evidence. For instance, another thing we might look at is, okay, for this particular article, the model predicted that it really supports the claim being true. But what if the AI made a mistake, because AI is fallible? You can correct it here, and again, and see in real time how the model changes predictions as a result. Now, because this model is so simple or so transparent, I know I'm not being tricked. I can set sort of the state of any of these things, the reputations and the stances, to be anything I want, and I can make sure the prediction I get at the end is what I would expect it to be. And therefore, I can audit the system and make sure the system is believable. I can correct mistakes, and as we talked about, I could collaboratively sit down with somebody else, for instance. We could look at this together and maybe have a more grounded discussion on where we disagree. Okay, so that's the demo. I'll switch back to my slides now. So that was talking a little bit about transparency in particular. I wanted to talk a little bit more now about fairness and give you one of the examples that we've been thinking a lot about in our research around disinformation and AI. So when I gave you this stage or pipeline of how we do fact-checking, I actually left out one important stage at the beginning, which is how do we choose which claims we're going to check? So if there's way more claims out there in the world than fact-checkers can ever check, and maybe a fact-checker can do one claim per day, how do they choose? How do they prioritize which claim they're going to fact-check? This is often known as check-worthiness. We might think about all kinds of factors like, for instance, what is the likeliness of this claim to cause harm? How much is it going to spread? Things like this, the severity of it. So again, this is really important for prioritizing our limited human resources. The question is, how do we decide when there's so many different things you might choose from about what to fact check, how to prioritize? So one fact-checking agency had their policy, which I noted just actually changed very recently, but what they always said was, we write about whatever items the greatest number of readers are asking about, which sounds really great. You know, they're going to serve whatever most people are asking about. This is broadly what's known as utilitarianism, or the idea of doing the greatest good for the greatest number. So what you're going to do here is serve whatever the majority of people are asking about. And that's great, except what about people who aren't in the majority? So there was some work done by a couple of PhD students here this year called Does AI-Assisted Fact-Checking Disproportionately Benefit Majority Groups? And they're looking at these kinds of policies about how is it that we can when we decide which claims to fact check, have assistive AI technology that's helping us prioritize things, not just based on what's most popular with the majority, but what might potentially impact minority groups or vulnerable populations more severely. How do we think more intentionally about prioritizing majority versus minority needs in prioritizing these limited resources? And this becomes an issue of fairness, and with this kind of thing that we think about broadly around AI fairness. Okay, so at this point, I want to just think a little more broadly about ways that AI or generative AI technologies might be changing some of the ways that we access information or be experiencing elections or politics. So there was an interesting study recently where a couple of professors used generative AI to send fake letters to state legislators claiming to be, from concerned voters. What they actually saw was essentially there was no difference in response rate from the elected officials, whether it was an AI-generated letter or a real voted letter, which is to say the politicians who are trying to understand what the needs of their constituents are and how to serve them could be fed disinformation and potentially not be able to identify it versus information coming from real respondents. So we often think about disinformation affecting us as, say, voters or the broad population, but we also need to think about ways disinformation might target or could be targeted towards our elected officials. So how do our constituents, how do officials know what kind of information they get? And what if you get so much of this stuff, what might be called like a denial of service attack in systems in computer science? If you send so much of this stuff, can people feed it out like spam in order to get to the real constituent inquiries? Another interesting thing happened earlier this year when President Biden announced he would run again for president. Within hours, the Republican National Committee released this ad video, and what was interesting was there's this disclaimer in the top left saying that this was built entirely with AI imagery. And so this was sort of showing the way in which these kind of technologies accelerate the way that we can spread information like this. And it raises questions like, is a disclaimer in small text at the top of a video enough? Or do we need to do something more to help people understand whether content is real or generated? And this is to the RNC's great credit. They did make this disclosure. They were clear that this was generated content. But a foreign adversary could not be expected to play by the same rules. And so how do we think about dealing with this kind of content when people aren't necessarily going to be doing responsible things like that? One of the scariest stories I was reading in recent times came from Brookings, talking about imagining what happened if on the day of election we were to have a real-time disinformation attack. And they talk about how, I think, the question is not whether or not we're going to have disinformation, but really how much of it there will be and how severe the consequences and how sophisticated the attacks will be. So considering the morning of election day, we have a contested presidential election, and a candidate or some foreign party launches a disinformation campaign that's aimed at suppressing votes. AI could help provide insights into the dynamics of that emerging disinformation attack. But after that, the response will need to be overseen by humans. This is this human-AI teaming and sort of looking at what's the frontier of what we can really rely on AI to do autonomously in a high-stakes setting, and where we need to have human in the loop. So one of the reasons why we often try to use automation and AI, again, is scalability. And if we have sort of a real-time, high-scale attack like this, this is where human scalability is really going to be a challenge. And so the problem is, for most topics and events, there simply won't be the resources for staffing. There won't be enough humans there to be in the loop, to deal with these responses, and we're going to have to deal with things often after the fact. So I think this is one of the great challenges ahead of us right now in thinking about how to anticipate and how to respond to these kinds of high-velocity attacks when there isn't time to do this sort of careful fact-checking that we would normally do. So some other things generally we can think about. With AI, we might be able to do a lot better modeling of who the different voters are, and the extent to which a lot of information about us is shared in the United States, different than Europe, where people have a lot more control over their data. That kind of personalization could enable us to be targeted for persuasion campaigns much more effectively than we've been traditionally. And we've already talked a bit about today about how this easier and faster generation of content could enable the propagation of this sort of disinformation. And one of these lines from this that stuck with me was this notion that we could, again, pollute the information ecosystem to such the point where people distrust any information online. And that's one of the interesting things that disinformation does. It doesn't necessarily always convince people of something that's not true, but it raises their doubt and skepticism about knowing what's true. And often that's enough to get people to stay home and not vote, to tune out and not participate. We talked earlier, if we generated all these fake letters to our congressmen, they might not know what's real and just tune out the letters they get. If we get all this information, we don't know what's real, we might just tune out. So this is a real challenge. There are a few guardrails today about this. So for instance, the technology companies who are developing these generative AI technologies are trying to impose guardrails to guard against their misuse, but it's very hard. The thing that makes generative AI so exciting and powerful is that it can generate anything. When it can generate anything, that makes it very hard to design guardrails against all the things it shouldn't generate. But the companies are trying to do this with the sort of generative AI technologies that are accessed by API. But anyone can get an open source technology and do whatever they want with it. And that's caused a lot of questions about what we should and shouldn't be sharing online as this technology advances. We were also talking about disclosure requirements. So the RNC, to their credit, again, had that disclosure in the top of their ad, but there's no requirement today, legal requirement in general, that such disclosures be provided. Are those the kind of regulations or policies we'd like to have in place? So yeah, some things I think we want to think about are transparency, again, those kinds of disclosure requirements. When you're interacting with your politicians, to what extent you might be interacting with a chat bot rather than a person. And even if we impose all these kinds of policies, how are we actually going to enforce them in practice? So one of the most important things we can do is information literacy. This has traditionally been the domain of education, whether it's K through 12 or university, or libraries have had a big role in this traditionally. Information literacy is educating ourselves and the rest of our society about how to be more informed, more discerning consumers of content. So over 10 years ago, then President Obama declared a National Information Literacy Awareness Month, talking then about how when we have this sort of amazing, as it was called, Web 2.0, where sort of anyone can publish anything online, it's this wonderful democratization of information exchange, but now we have this crisis of authenticity. You know, we don't have publisher controls, peer review, always ensuring that everything that goes online is checked. And so it's really then beholden on us to ensure we invest in this kind of information literacy education to ensure that we're all informed when we go to the voting box or otherwise. These technologies like generative AI are also changing the ways we access information. And so, for instance, people might have traditionally gone to Google and searched for information about an election. And there have always been questions about whether certain rankings of search results could influence voting outcomes, and there's been various debate around that. But what we're seeing with these kinds of generative AI technologies is that people would much rather, not have to read 10 blue links and have to click on things, but to just ask a question and get an answer. So people like this kind of experience, the user experience of just being able to ask generative AI questions and get feedback. And one of the challenges here is the content that generative AI produces is highly fluent. It looks very polished, and yet at the same time, it's often wrong. There are often factuality errors just due to the limitations of the technology itself. And so traditionally, when we searched online and we clicked on a blue link, We could tell often if the information was bad because there was a misspelling or grammar errors or a web page that was poorly formatted. And so the visual cues we look for normally to assess information as part of our information literacy are having more trouble now in this generative AI era because the information looks very fluent and polished, and yet it might be incorrect. So one interesting thing I just sort of played with a little bit was this was using Bing's search engine. And they have actually some suggested questions. So in addition to sort of answering things, they have some suggested questions to guide what you might search for. So for instance, if I say, tell me about Republican candidates for president, it provided this nice information. I don't have to click on any blue links. I just get this information. And then it even suggests other things I might want to know about. So for instance, I can click on one of these other questions I want to know about. What are key issues, for instance? Again, it's going to generate a bunch of content for helping me understand what are the key issues. So this is a really different information experience in how we access information. Again, it feels very nice in just reading things and not having to click along, but we're very reliant on this information being factual and trusting, say, a provider, a major search engine or something for ensuring this information is correct. So one place where we have open research right now is trying to really ensure factuality and provide what's called provenance. So we sort of provide resources, like here you see links to sources where information comes from. One of the funny or scary things, depending how you look at it, is if you ask these generative AI technologies to answer a question and provide supporting evidence, they will generate links like this to sources and papers that are totally imaginary and don't exist. So the work that you're seeing here is not that. This is where we're working today increasingly to actually make sure that answers being provided by generative AI technologies are tied to real sources. But again, these technologies are amazing at hallucinating content that's imaginary that seems quite convincing. So sort of wrapping up for today, again, we're at this really interesting time where AI is more ubiquitous and powerful than ever. There's so many potential opportunities, but also we see a lot of risks of harm. And one of the things, it's ultimately the role of our elected officials to help put limits on how this technology can be used. So if you take something like nuclear power, you can make energy with it, but you can also build bombs. So the question of what we do with AI in that sense is it's a political question. And it's not something that should ever be decided by technologists alone. And this is really resonant with what we've been trying to do in good systems here at UT Austin, where we really think that technologists alone can't design, build, or evaluate responsible AI technologies. It really takes a village of diverse perspectives and backgrounds, and that's what we're trying to do here today. So with that, I'll thank you all for listening and turn it over for a fun quiz.
Thanks, Matt, for the really cool talk and also for this compelling live demo. I'm sure you're going to get a lot of increasing hits today from that. So questions have been rolling in, and for everybody joining online, just as a reminder, you have a question and answer button on the top of your video screen. Click on that, and we can look at your questions. Okay, but why don't we start with a question from our live audience? I think there was a question there.
Yeah. So one of my questions was in regards to the guardrails for the misuse of generative AI in the political aspect. Like, what are some guardrails that you're personally excited for, or some guardrails that you personally think have potential?
Sure. So one of the things we're thinking a lot about, for instance, is toxic language. So this would be at the extreme, things like hate speech or something like that. So you want to make sure that when you interact with generative AI, we both try to detect at what's called the prompt, when you ask it for what you want, whether you're asking for something that's inappropriate, and then as well as try to constrain or check the generation of content to make sure it doesn't produce stuff. So we don't want to produce stuff like hate speech, which could be offensive. In the context of today's talk around disinformation, similarly, you don't want an adversary, right, generating this kind of disinformation. So again, we're going to look at the kinds of prompts that people issue about what they're asking it to do and trying to detect if it's an inappropriate request, and then look at, again, what the model generates on the output and try to constrain that there. So those are a couple of examples.
Cool. So there were a couple of questions related to this distinction between misinformation and malinformation. And I think you had a very nice Venn diagram which spoke about the differences and the intersection between them. And I think there was a question which I'll read out. It said that it feels like misinformation, while not straightforward necessarily, at least has the potential for objective evaluation. In the case of malinformation, however, it seems to require more subjective interpretation of the intentions and the potential outcomes. So how do researchers and in general AI systems balance the need for fighting malinformation versus the risk of molding these large systems to our own subjective opinions?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting and broad question. So one good point maybe to start with is that fact-checking is about veracity. So fact checkers are focused on what are questions that can be assessed. So for instance, sometimes if the claim is, I ate cornflakes for breakfast this morning, that might be true or false, but there's no way to tell whether it's true or false. Other things that people say that don't have any kind of true or false to determine are not something you can determine factually. And so fact checkers, that's not the domain of work they work in. So who then is looking at this domain of all this kind of information? I think today we see a lot of this through the social media platforms who are trying to have community guidelines or policy by what content is acceptable or not. And we've seen, for instance, on Twitter, now X, that changed quite dramatically under the new leadership. So it's definitely a real challenge for us. I think particularly also issues of free speech are dominant. So for instance, there was a platform that was, its famous tagline was about promoting free speech, but was particularly damaging forms of things that were being said until sort of it got shut down. And so I think we have real challenges politically and how we think about balancing freedoms like free speech against the kind of protections we want to do of ensuring people aren't harmed. I guess one sort of digression I just want to say something about quickly is I think we see so much talk, I think, in public circles right now about freedom, 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 and never thinking about the fact that we desire to give up all kinds of freedom for the benefits of society. I like knowing that I can walk out on the street and nobody's going to rob me or beat me up. And I give up a lot of freedom in order to have those kinds of protections. So I think we have to kind of have more of a conversation about the kind of ways that we do want to restrain the ways we communicate with one another in order to have some protections and freedoms. But in general, yeah, it's quite challenging. And so who are the arbiters of this kind of information, whether it's truth or what's damaging content? And I think we have laws about it, we have technology policies, and maybe we have other kinds of community norms, but it's definitely a messy space and it changes over different platforms or different geographies. And I had the opportunity to address the Republican caucus here of the state legislature recently, And that was one of the first questions I got in Q&A is, essentially, who's deciding what's truth? Or if we talk about intent, whoever can figure out what was the intent behind this message is definitely very tricky. So I think, indeed, this is this kind of subjective setting where we're trying to figure out what is the kind of content that's most likely to cause the most harm, and how can we mitigate or prevent it?
Right. So related to that, I think there is also this problem that perceived bias, even if there is no bias, is potentially as damaging as there being real bias in a system. So what can be done to engender this, or to promote the fact, or at least alleviate people's worries about there being a perceived bias in a system? What could be done to do that?
Yeah, so bias and fairness are very interrelated concepts in general in AI. Like a broad thing just to talk about sort of fairness broadly is we usually throw out a word like fair in common parlance, and we think we know what we mean, but when we really dig into it, there are so many different definitions of what's fair, and those definitions often conflict with one another, and often they're relevant to different groups, and who are we trying to protect. So we've seen a lot of work traditionally where people come up with lots of different mathematical formulations of fairness, but they were disconnected with what society's needs actually were. So I think we're trying to understand in different use cases, what is fair and what is biased, and how can we sort of handle that with the relevant stakeholders who are potentially going to be involved or impacted by the system in question. So with perceived bias, that's definitely, again, sort of a tricky issue with no clear answer. One of the things I think it's important to talk about is a sort of, again, diversity of stakeholders. So, let's just say, hypothetically, you have a software company that's entirely made up of white men who look just like me. There's a real good chance that there's going to be content that we don't even notice because it's outside our particular background and looking at it. So one of the best ways you can make AI systems less biased and less fair is to bring lots of diverse stakeholders to bear throughout the process. And so, we're sort of doing this with good systems here at UT from diversity, but I was at an industry conference here in Austin where this is one of the main things I heard on stage was having to get all kinds of diverse folks across your tech company involved in this, whether it's different professional backgrounds or racial, ethno, demographic, whatever, really trying to get diverse eyes on it, because the first thing is we can't even see the bias and we won't know it's there. Once we detect it, then we have a chance to think about, who are the stakeholders, who might be affected, and what is the kind of intervention that makes the most sense. And I'm sorry, it's hard to give a very precise answer, but I think the main thing is that sort of broad approach.
Okay, so so I like this idea of this broader approach, and I think you also touched a little bit on the fact that technologists alone should not be the deciders of this, and I think that's a very good takeaway to have as well. So now switching gears to a slightly different topic, which is what happens when you spoke about veracity and correctness and factuality. What happens when the best information that we have at a given point of time is still evolving? Is it the responsibility of like an AI-based fact checker to attempt to investigate whether the facts are still evolving, and once if that's indeed the case, is it the responsibility of the system to go back and self-correct itself?
Yeah, so these notions of sort of real-time influence campaigns or just searches are, of course, the most challenging. So I gave this sort of model of information literacy where you look for relevant resources and then based on them, try to understand the veracity, say, of what you're reading. But if something is really new, there might not be any resources out there. Even more sort of dangerous is we've seen disinfluence or disinformation campaigns where before sort of the claim is released, they actually seed lots of fake content online such that when people do go and search and start searching for information, the only search results they found when the first thing comes out is actually the stuff that's been planted in advance to do this. So it's definitely very tricky in this space. So, when we're thinking about when we need to have this kind of, immediate real-time response, of course, people can't respond in that way. So we're going to have some kind of automation with whatever disclaimers about that this is evolving, this is unknown. And you hear, journalists report like this all the time. This is what we know so far, here's what we're sharing. And there are journalistic standards also about how much information is enough to report something at all, because you don't want to, like sometimes even when something is obviously not true, you don't want to fact check it because you're elevating that disinformation and giving it more prominence and visibility than it might have gotten otherwise. So what point should a journalist report on something when they only have evidence that's less reliable about that? So I think we have journalistic standards to guide us there. And the question now is how to marry that into sort of this automation technology such that we can provide sort of, as you say, disclaimers, this is evolving information, or just like journalists will go and report a correction later, the kind of correction that might be reported by an AI.
Mm-hmm. So in relation to the use of these tools, in your experience, and you spoke about working with several professional fact checkers, what is the state of adoption of AI tools in curbing disinformation, and where do you see that going, or where do you see that going, and where do you hope that will go?
Yeah, so I mean, we definitely want to help all of these, amazing, talented fact checkers who are working around the world and trying to ensure that we do have reliable access to information, journalists as well in this space. And so, as I mentioned, we did these interviews, or my student particularly did these interviews with these fact checkers from around the world. And what we saw was that a lot of the technologies that have been built in natural language processing aren't being used. And I think this is because as a computer scientist, and I am one by training, our tendency is to work on fun, interesting technical problems. We don't necessarily understand a particular application, domain, or area where something will be used. And then the sort of metaphor is throw it over the fence and then hope somebody uses it on the other side, which is really different than starting with more of a user-centered design lens when you start with your users first and really try to understand their needs and develop technologies for them. Agencies like Medan and Full Fact have been some of the ones that I think we've interacted with, who we've been sort of most impressed with sort of the technology pipeline they're using. And they certainly are trying to make use of the technologies that are supporting their fact checkers. But in the reading we had for today, we were trying to sort of understand this business about so much of the work that's gone today in developing automated fact checking and sort of where it falls short in terms of what the human fact checkers actually need. So we identify in that paper, I believe, or maybe it's one we actually just released on arXiv, some of the things that we think that human fact checkers have asked for about the greatest sort of areas for innovation they're hoping for. And that's where we're trying to sort of encourage future work here at the university and more broadly.
Okay, so it would be great if you could actually share some of these links that you spoke about so we can share it broadly with the class. We actually have a large number of questions, which unfortunately we didn't have the time to get to. But let me just thank you again for your wonderful talk and your demo. What I want to do is actually very briefly talk about what's coming up next. So as I mentioned, we touched on some of these topics at the intersection of society and AI. And next week, we'll look at bias and fairness in AI models and ethical data sets with S. Craig Watkins. So see you then. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.